This happened a few years ago, on the 5th of January 2017. My name is Emily Hall, and after graduating from college in 2009, I began living alone in a remote cabin my uncle left me after he passed. The home was nestled in a secluded area just outside the city limits of Asheville, North Carolina. While I initially thought I would be only living there for a short time, I came to love having my own space, surrounded by trees and nature, while still being close to my relatives at work in the city. Understandably, when I told anyone I lived alone in the middle of the woods, I could immediately tell their minds were racing through all the possible ways that could go wrong. However, with all that being said, I had been living in the cabin for almost 10 years at the time, and I was certain that the horror movies and scary stories about the secret evils that occur in the woods were just that, stories. One day, my mom and I had to go shopping for groceries before visiting our local veterinarian for medicine my dogs needed. After doing all that, I ended up driving home pretty late at night. As I drove silently on the empty road, I found myself getting lost in thought when, suddenly, out of nowhere, a deer darted across the road, completely covered in what I assumed was its own blood. I slammed on the brakes and immediately looked to see if I had made contact with the deer. But it almost seemed like it was so focused on running away from something that it didn't even notice my headlights coming up. After taking a moment to calm down, I got out of the car to check for damages, and while there was nothing wrong with the car itself, I did notice a huge trail of blood the deer had left behind, leaving me asking the question, what was it running from? I get home about 30 minutes after the incident and immediately began taking the groceries out of the car and into the house. Just as I went out for the last bag, I heard a faint sound coming from the woods, almost like an animal had stepped on and broken a stick. This wasn't the strangest thing you heard in the woods, but the sound was so faint that I'm certain if I hadn't already been stressed from the earlier incident, I wouldn't have heard it at all. That stress, however, was also the reason I chose to ignore the sound, as I figured I was probably just paranoid and needed to get indoors and relax. The time was around 11 p.m. that night. I had taken a bath about 15 minutes earlier, given my dogs their medication, and decided to spend some time with them while watching TV to relax. At that point, I had almost completely forgotten about the deer incident earlier that night. But just as it was starting to feel like a regular Saturday night, my dogs suddenly began pacing back and forth in the living room, barking furiously towards the window and pawing at me in an attempt to get my attention. I was obviously startled by the sudden barking, and although I knew they had taken medication earlier that night, I wasn't convinced it would make them act that way. So confused, I quickly stood up to see what was causing their reaction. At first glance, there didn't seem to be anything outside the window, but as I looked closer, the silhouette of someone hiding in the trees slowly revealed itself before quickly retreating back into the woods. As soon as I saw the person leave, I ran upstairs to get the hunting gun my uncle kept for emergencies like that and headed outside to see who it was. Once I stepped outside, however, I was instantly filled with regret, and my heart sank as I looked around, horrified to see my house had been surrounded by dead deer, rabbits, and birds that seemed to have been brutally bludgeoned to death. A stench filled the air, and I threw up a little in my mouth before noticing the animal skulls that had been attached to sticks hidden in the trees. At that moment, I wasn't sure what was going on, but I knew I wasn't safe. So I immediately turned and ran back into the house when suddenly the air around me was filled with a piercing ringing noise that forced me to fall to the floor and cover my ears in pain. The strange sound seemed to affect my dogs even worse, as they began to whine in pain before frantically running towards the walls and forcefully smashing their heads repeatedly. There wasn't much I could do except watch in silence and confusion, as one by one, the dogs slammed into the wall in such a mortifying way that I can't describe. Soon enough, the walls were covered in blood. The dogs went silent and eventually fell to the ground dead. I, however, was not so lucky, as the ringing noise continued to torment me for hours on end. Finally, just when I felt like I was about to die from a migraine, the noise stopped, and after a brief second of deafening silence, the woods returned to its usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves. I woke up at around 5 p.m. the next day. My head felt like it had been hit by a rock, and it didn't seem like anyone had a clue about what happened to me the previous night. And I knew that wouldn't change unless I somehow found a way to get myself to the hospital for treatment or dial 911 for help. Walking didn't seem like an option at the time, talk less of driving. So I somehow found the strength to drag myself upstairs to my phone before sending my mom a quick text message that said, "Help." Shortly after, my family showed up with the police and medics, and realizing I was too helpless to answer any questions about the horrific scene that was my home, the medics took me to the hospital, and the police followed close behind, eager for answers about what happened to me and my dogs the night before. I didn't blame them at the time. As I understood, they had questions, but I had questions too, and we quickly came to realize we all had questions no one had the answers to. That night in January left me and my town in a state of disbelief and fear for months. I stayed silent for weeks after that night, and locals came up with theories that I had been cursed by demons or was a victim of satanic rituals. The truth, however, was that my head hurt so badly for the next few days that I couldn't speak, and when the pain eventually subsided, the fear of whoever I had seen that night returning kept me from saying anything. Numerous enthusiasts came and news channels covered the story of that night, but despite their best efforts, no one knew what the sacrifices or symbols meant. Soon enough, they all gave up, and my family and I relocated to Sydney, Australia, where I am today. It's been 7 years since the incident, and not a single day has gone by without thinking about the shadow in the woods. This story is loosely based on the case of a woman named Lauren. Lauren's house was marked with different items and figures by a strange man in the woods, whom she didn't notice until her dogs began to bark violently at the window. Details of the case are scarce out of respect for Lauren's family. But to this day, no one knows who the man was or what his plan was for Lauren after completing his ritual in the woods.
I know it's been a while, but I still see pictures of my friends, and I cry. We'd known each other for years. We'd shared many things as Boy Scouts, and none of them deserved the fate that befell them. That night we arrived in the Chattahoochee National Forest at dusk after a long hike. We decided to set up camp near a small clearing, surrounded by trees that protected us from the wind. While the others volunteered to fetch firewood and food, it was up to me and Tom to set up the tents. The minutes passed, and my friends didn't return. The sun was already going down. Tom, who had always been the most carefree of the group, began to show signs of anxiety. "Where are the boys? Don't you think they're taking too long?" "They must have been distracted by something. They'll be back." I thought they would come back, although I was a little worried. I tried not to think about it too much, but every second that passed without news from the others made me more nervous. Finally, the darkness fell completely. Something was very wrong. "I'm going to look for them. They can't be lost. We're not that far from the camp." "You're right. Wait for me to fix this, and I'll go with you." "No need. You take care of that. I'll be back soon." After Tom left, time passed slowly. I stood still, listening, waiting for any sign of my friends or Tom, but nothing. None came, and now I was terrified. Suddenly, I heard something. It was a low sound, almost a murmur, but it was coming from somewhere in the trees. I turned off the flashlight and stood silently, trying to locate where it was coming from. I thought it was Tom, so I approached, relieved. I kept walking, until suddenly I stopped. That wasn't Tom, and that wasn't a whisper. It was a laugh, and it wasn't from any of my friends. I backed slowly towards the tent and hid in it, with my flashlight off and my eyes wide open. I had no idea how to react. I was frozen with fear. Then, I heard it. Footsteps. Light but steady footsteps, walking around the tent. I stood perfectly still, trying to control my breathing. I couldn't see anything, but I knew someone was there, walking around, watching the tent, knowing that I was in it. Then, it happened. The zip at the entrance of the tent began to move. Slowly opening. My heart was pounding in my chest, and terror swept over me. Someone was opening the tent from the outside. A man stuck his head into the tent. The man was terrifying. Maybe there wasn't much to differentiate him aesthetically from a normal man, but his look, his gestures, his smile. This man looked like a monster. Unable to move or scream, I just sat there, staring at him, not knowing what to do. He just looked at me, smiling, enjoying my fear. He crawled into the tent, his huge figure blocking the exit. Panic seized me, and before I knew it, I'd closed my eyes, expecting the worst. I felt his breath on my face, hot as his low, throaty laugh.
Hello.
Not knowing what to do, I answered. What do you want? What are you going to do to me?
I just came to visit. I'm a very curious person. Where are your friends?
I don't know. I'm waiting for them.
I think I saw them. If you want, I can show you where they are. I don't think they moved.
That was all I had to hear. My friends were dead. I let out a little scream of fear and closed my eyes again.
So much tension around here, don't you think? I know. Let's play a game.
What?
How about rock, paper, scissors?
Rock, paper, scissors. The fact he was even saying that was absurd and terrifying at the same time. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I tried to process what he had just said. He stepped closer, invading my personal space, until I couldn't breathe without smelling his nauseating stench. Will you let me go if I win?
Don't be silly. I'll let you go anyway. I admit, I like you, and I'm not going to lie to you. I'm a soft-hearted person. I'm bored. Let's play.
I had no choice. I had to play. Every fiber of my being was screaming that this was a trap, that I was doomed, that he would kill me, and no one would find me. But what choice did I have? I raised my hand, and he raised his too, his long, misshapen fingers ready for the game. We counted together. Rock. Paper. Scissors. I threw my hand forward with the desperation of someone who knows his life depends on it. He did the same. He had chosen scissors, and I had chosen paper.
I guess I win. That means I'm going to have to kill you, right?
But you said you wouldn't kill me.
Oh, did I say that?
The man wasn't laughing anymore. He slowly approached me, stretching out his hands to intimidate me, as if showing me that I couldn't escape. My legs weakened, and I felt the world collapsing around me. But then, instead of attacking, he burst out laughing.
It's true. I forgot for a moment. I'm sorry. I'll let you go.
After that, the man approached the exit of the tent and left. Then he waited at the end of the exit with the tent open, politely inviting me to leave. I staggered out of the tent, my breath coming in gasps, and my heart hammering in my chest. I started to walk to the car, but the man was walking behind me. I couldn't turn around. I couldn't look him in the eye. I had to keep going, hoping he would let me go. Maybe I could try to run, attack him, scream. No, none of that would be a good idea. My only chance was to beg him to let me go. On the way, I saw a few of my friends' bodies, or what was left of them, scattered on the ground. There was no sign of a struggle, only death. I stopped for a second, shocked at what I was seeing. He chuckled softly, but gently pushed me in the back, signaling me to keep going. As we moved forward, the distance between us grew even shorter. There was not even half a meter between his body and mine. As he got closer, I could hear his breathing behind me. The back of my neck was moist from his breath. He was doing it on purpose to scare me. And it was working very well. When we finally reached the road, I felt a horrible pain in the back of my neck. I screamed from it and the fear, and that's when I realized what had happened. The man had bitten me, tearing off a chunk of my flesh with his teeth. I could feel my blood running down my neck, and that was the sign that I couldn't wait any longer. I ran, without looking back, knowing that if I did, I would be finished. When I finally dared to turn my head, he was there, standing at the edge of the forest, watching me as he chewed on the piece of my flesh. They never found the bodies of my friends. They only found me, bleeding to death on the roadside, on the verge of collapse. I always thought I was an unlucky person for what I experienced that day. Today, I think the opposite. I think I'm a very lucky person, as I survived what I would later learn was Gary Hilton, a dangerous serial killer known for hunting humans in the woods and leaving no survivors. This story is inspired by the crimes of Gary Hilton, a serial killer. He was an American known as the National Forest serial killer. Hilton was a predator that stalked people in remote forest areas of the southeastern United States, kidnapping and brutally murdering his victims. Gary Hilton is currently alive and serving multiple life sentences without a chance for parole from a Florida state prison. Furthermore, he was sentenced to death in 2011 for one of his many crimes, although he has remained on death row since then, awaiting the execution of his sentence.
When it all happened, it was a simple Friday night. I had been working late that day. I had just broken up with my partner, so I was pretty depressed. I needed to start going out again. I decided to have a drink in a bar I had never visited before to do something different, one that was on the outskirts of the city, far from my comfort zone. The bar was small, dark, and with an unfriendly clientele. It wasn't the kind of place I was used to, but that made it exciting, or at least I thought so at the time. I sat at the bar and ordered a beer. As I drank, a man sat down next to me. He was short, skinny, and clean-shaven. I didn't recognize him at the time, but later learned who he was. We started talking, and the man introduced himself as Robert. He said he worked as a baker, and that he used to come to the bar after a long day's work. His conversation was normal, even boring, but there was something in his eyes, something that made me want to keep talking to him. When I finished my beer, I got up to leave, but he insisted on walking me to the car. I guess there was nothing wrong with him. He was just a nice guy, right? But when we got to my car, everything changed. I felt a bump on my head, and the world went dark. I woke up with a stabbing pain in my head, dazed and disoriented. My vision was blurry, but gradually I began to make out my surroundings. I was in a dark, cold, and dirty place. The air smelled musty and earthy. I tried to move, but my hands were tied with a rough rope that cut my skin every time I tried to free myself. Panic began to grow inside me. I didn't know where I was, who had taken me there, or why. The last thing I remembered was Robert, that man from the bar. How had it come to this? What did he want from me? Soon after, I heard footsteps approaching. I tried to pretend to fall asleep, but my rapid breathing gave me away. I felt his presence before I saw him. Robert was standing in front of me, smiling. That laugh was not the same man who had been in the bar with me. This was a monster. He began to speak. His voice was calm, almost friendly, which made everything even more scary. He explained that he had been watching me, that he had been waiting for the perfect moment to act. It wasn't the first time he had done something like this, and according to his words, it wouldn't be the last either. He told me that all I had to do was cooperate and that if I did, maybe he would let me live. My mind was racing, looking for a way to escape, but I was bound and helpless. Robert wasted no time. He grabbed my arm and dragged me out of the room where he had awakened me. I tried to resist, but it was no use. He carried me to his truck where he threw me in the back like a sack of potatoes. I could feel the cold metal of the floor on my skin as he slammed the back door shut with a clang. The ride was long, or so it seemed to me. Every second felt like an eternity. Finally, the van came to a stop. I heard the driver's door open and then his footsteps approaching. When he opened the back doors, I realized that we were in the middle of a forest. There was no sign of civilization for miles. Robert pulled me out of the truck and pushed me to the ground. I felt the thump in my ribs and the taste of blood in my mouth. He started laughing as he watched me struggle to get up. Then he pulled a hunting knife from his belt, held it in front of me, and told me to run. I'll give you a head start. If you escape, you will be free. But if I catch you, I will slit your throat and throw your parts in your family's house. At that moment, I listened to him and obeyed. I thought of nothing but running. I got up from the ground and started running as fast as my legs would let me. I could hear his laughter behind me, and that urged me to keep going, not to look back. The forest was dense, full of tall trees and undergrowth that made it difficult for me to move forward. The branches scratched my skin, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I knew that if I did, I would be dead. Every noise in the forest felt like a threat, but none was more terrifying than the footsteps I heard behind me, getting closer and closer. I didn't know how long I had been running. The pain in my legs was unbearable, but I knew he was close, that he could appear at any moment and end it all. Then, I heard a crunching sound to my left. I stopped for a second, paralyzed with terror, and then I saw him. Robert was only a few feet away. I ran again, but this time I had no clear direction. I just wanted to get away from him, but the forest was huge. As I ran, I began to realize that the forest was much bigger than I thought. I felt that with every step I took, I was more lost, far from any hope of rescue. Fear turned into despair when I realized that if I kept going, I would end up lost forever in that place, or, even worse, be eaten by some wild animal. I had no choice. I had to face Robert. I decided to turn back, to go back to where it had all started, hoping to find his truck in some way to escape. It was my only chance. I started running desperately. I didn't know if I was taking the right path, but the longer I ran, the more chances there were that Robert would find me. I ran and ran, but avoiding making too much noise. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, I arrived at the place where it had all started. There was his truck. The sight of the vehicle gave me a small spark of hope. I had no time to think. I ran to the van, praying that the keys were inside. When I got there, I tried to open the driver's door, but it was locked. I tried to force the door open or break the window, but nothing would work. I felt desperation take hold of me, and then I heard a noise behind me. I turned around, and there was Robert, slowly advancing towards me with the knife in his hand. His smile had faded. Now all I could see was pure determination on his face. If I didn't do something, I was dead. In an impulse of desperation, I dropped to the ground, looking for something, anything I could use as a weapon. My hand brushed against a good-sized stone, and without a second thought, I grabbed it. Robert was a few steps away from me when I lunged at him, hitting him in the ear with all the force I could muster. The impact made him stagger and let out a cry of pain. I took advantage of his confusion to search for the keys in the cab of the truck. My trembling hand managed to find the bundle, and I quickly slid into the driver's seat, slamming the door tightly shut. Robert recovered faster than I expected and started banging on the window, trying to break it with the knife. I managed to start the van and stun the accelerator with all my might, and the van roared as I drove forward, pulling me away from that hellish place. I could see him in the rearview mirror, screaming and running after me, but he quickly vanished into the darkness. I didn't dare look back. I just kept driving, not knowing where I was going, but with only one certainty: I had survived. Days later, when the wounds in my body began to heal, I learned that my pursuer, Robert Hansen, had been arrested. It was not because of me, but because another woman, just as unfortunate, had managed to escape and denounce him. The police had found evidence in his home, a chilling collection of mementos of all his previous victims. The news spoke of him as the Forest Killer, a predator who had hunted women for years, taking them into the woods and chasing them like animals. The horror I felt when I heard these details was indescribable. I had been through what they had been through, and I could have been one of his victims. This story is inspired by the crimes of Robert Hansen, known as the Butcher Baker and the Forest Killer. Hansen was an American serial killer who terrorized Anchorage, Alaska during the 1970s and 1980s. Known for his seemingly harmless appearance as a local baker, Hansen led a secret life in which he abducted women, took them into the Alaskan wilderness, and then hunted them like animals before murdering them. Robert Hansen died in 2014 while serving 461 years in prison without the possibility of parole. He had been convicted in 1984 for his heinous crimes after one of his victims escaped and helped the authorities catch him.
This happened when I was about 7 years old. My grandparents lived in a small town in Arkansas. My parents and I used to visit them often, and during our trips, I used to go on these small hikes with my grandparents. That day, too, my grandparents and I went out for a hike on one of the new paths my grandparents had recently discovered. The part in which we used to hike was a wilderness, meaning no vehicles had access to it, and not many humans went there either. This trail was new to me. I'd never been there, but as we reached the end of the trail, I could immediately tell why my grandparents had chosen this spot. The trail ended on a bluff that overlooked a small river that flowed underneath it. This bluff was about 200 meters high and was a serene spot to sit and spend some time. On our return journey, I clearly remember spotting a waterfall a few meters away from our trail. It was about 11:30 a.m. and I desperately wanted to see the waterfall up close. My grandpa walked a few meters away from us to scout the path toward this waterfall, but there was no walkable path leading to this waterfall. So they both refused to take me there. I admit, I was a bit of a stubborn child back then. I cried and threw a tantrum in the middle of the forest. I sat on the ground and refused to move. My grandparents were used to my antics, so they just kept on walking ahead. Not too far, just far enough to show my 7-year-old self that they were leaving me behind. At some point, I knew that I was going to get my way. So with my head hanging between my shoulders, I started walking again. I slowed down my pace on purpose, but I clearly remember my grandpa turning after short intervals to keep an eye on me to make sure I was walking right on the trail. It was broad daylight. When I raised my head to look at my grandparents, suddenly they were not ahead of me. Instead, there was this line of huge trees, like a wall, and between them ran a small dirt trail. Given the fact that I hadn't been on this trail before, I thought this might be the right route. Besides, I had purposely slowed down. I was sure that my grandparents were up ahead, somewhere. I kept walking, and after maybe a couple of hours of walking, I could not find my grandparents or the way back home. I was a bit scared and exhausted, so I decided to sit on a nearby rock. After a few minutes, I decided to keep walking, and soon enough I reached the bluff that I had visited with my grandparents. It was weird that I had reached there again, but before I could decide to do anything, someone walked towards me from the tree line. "Hello," she said. She reached up to my shoulder in height and had black hair and brown eyes. She was wearing a frock and looked friendly. "Hello," I replied. "Who are you?" I asked. "I'm Mary," said the little girl. She came and stood in front of me and asked, "How old are you?" "I'm 7, and my name is Josh." "I'm 5. She seemed pretty harmless and not like my 7-year-old self knew any better. I was just happy to find someone there. We started talking and pretty soon we were good friends. By chatting with Mary, I quickly gathered that her parents were camping in the woods too. She and her family came to this part of the woods often, so she knew the way down. She had just started school and was struggling to make new friends, despite her funny jokes and sweet singing. She sang for me too and told me some very funny jokes. I thought that she was my new best friend. When the sunset was close, it was clear to me that I was lost and that Grandpa and Grandma would come for me, but I didn't know when. Mary agreed to stay with me for the night and to help me get back home in the morning. I was delighted indeed. We spent the night sleeping on the bluff, looking at the stars and sharing stories from our schools. She also brought me some berries from a nearby bush so I wouldn't be hungry. The next day, we climbed down the hill, and Mary, despite being smaller than me in age and size, was an expert hiker, almost as good as my father and Grandpa. Whenever the path became steep, she stood in front of me to help me come down safely. When we were down later that afternoon, she took me to a small cave-like structure and asked me to stay there for the night. She also got me some fruits from some nearby trees and led me to a small stream to drink water. The next day, we had to walk a lot to reach the nearby street from where I could go home. When we reached the street, Mary told me that she was happy she met me. Till then, I didn't want Mary to leave, and I wanted her to meet my parents. But she told me that she had to get back to her parents, and they would be very angry if she didn't come back soon. "Bye, Mary." "Bye, Josh." We waved at each other, and then she walked away, back into the forest. I was just sitting on a boulder when a small van passed me on the road. The driver stopped when he saw me sitting and jogged towards me in a hurry. There was another man in the van too. "Hey, are you Josh Davis?" the driver asked me. "Yes, sir," I replied. Immediately, both the men exchanged a funny look, and the other man rushed towards his van and made a few phone calls. Till then, the driver casually asked me where I was. "I was in the woods, sir," I said, to which the man seemed unconvinced. Within minutes, police cars had arrived, and amidst the chaos, there was a car that I very much recognized. It was my father's car, and out of it stepped my parents and grandparents. I was surrounded by my whole family, and everyone was hugging me, kissing me, and whatnot. It was hard for me to understand what had happened. Wasn't it just the punishment my grandparents gave me because I was being stubborn? Soon I was taken to the hospital and some unnecessary tests were performed on me. When the doctors were done with me, everyone was asking me the same questions. Where was I? And how did I end up on the corner of the road? So I told them the whole story of how I met Mary and how she helped me get down and how she was nice and funny and how she brought me food and told me stories about her school. Everyone, including my family, was baffled. I mean, I understand that it's odd to make friends in the woods, but Mary was really nice. Then I was told that I had been missing for almost 2 days, and there was a search party looking for me. The men who found me by the road had been a part of this search too. I didn't get it then, but now that I'm an old buzzard, I get how crazy all of it must have sounded. My story had made headlines, and now most of the people were worried about Mary too, until a man who was around 70 years old came up to my family and demanded to speak to me. He claimed he was Mary's dad. I was eager to meet him because that meant I could meet Mary too. But what the man told me still shocks me to my core today. Mary was lost in those woods about 35 years ago at the same spot where I met her, and later her dead body was discovered. The girl who I assumed was my best friend was not a girl, but a ghost all along. He asked me to describe Mary in great detail, and when he was satisfied that I wasn't joking, he showed me a picture of Mary. It was an old, yellow, crumpled picture of her. I broke into tears. But as I grew up, and I kept on reanalyzing the story, I figured maybe the spirit of Mary Wilson didn't want to see another kid end up in the same situation she did. She wanted to save my life because no one saved hers. Maybe Mary was a kind spirit. But the sweet smile of that little girl who saved me all those years ago still haunts me to this day.